All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. If you work with environmental management systems, you probably know that internal audits they can sometimes feel like this repetitive, almost tedious calendar exercise. But today we're looking at ISO 14001-2026 Clause 9.2 through a completely different lens. We're going to treat the internal auditor not as a paper pusher, but as an environmental detective.
So I've got to ask you, is your internal audit just a compliance tick box? Because if your audits just feel like you're going through the motions, barely scratching the surface, you might actually be missing the entire point of Clause 9.2. This clause isn't about just confirming that a piece of paper exists somewhere in a filing cabinet. It's about verifying that your environmental commitments are translating into real, operational reality on the floor. If you're just checking boxes, you're literally leaving your organization exposed to undetected risks and, worse, regulatory violations. To get there, we're going to break this ISO requirement down into a chronological detective's journey. We'll cover audit planning, objective execution, classifying our findings, root cause analysis, and finally, continual improvement. Okay, starting off with Section 1, audit planning, or as we like to call it, the audit journey. Now, here's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Your audit scope absolutely has to be dictated by environmental risk, not just some random schedule. ISO 14001-2026 demands a risk-based approach. You've got to consider environmental significance. Think about it. A chemical plant dealing with hazardous waste and emissions, they need to prioritize those high-risk areas, right? You also need to factor in past audit results, any big organizational changes, legal compliance obligations, and just how complex your operations are. If you're auditing low-risk administrative stuff with the exact same frequency as, say, high-risk wastewater treatment processes, well, your planning is fundamentally flawed. In fact, if your audit schedule hasn't changed in 3 years, you likely have a major nonconformance just hiding in plain sight. Our source material points out that one of the most common nonconformances lead auditors find is the total absence of risk-based planning. Relying on a static, fixed annual schedule that completely ignores how dynamic your environmental risk exposure is, that basically means your audit program is flying blind to new and evolving threats. Moving right along to Section 2, Objective Execution, which is all about gathering verifiable facts. There is a massive difference between ticking subjective boxes and gathering hard, objective evidence. The trap a lot of folks fall into is relying purely on checklists. You know the drill. An auditor asks, "Hey, do you have an environmental training program?" and ticks yes because the manager said so. But the gold standard here is objective evidence. That means the auditor doesn't just ask the question, they pull the actual training records, they cross-reference them with the specific people handling hazardous materials on the shop floor, and they verify that those employees actually understand the procedures. To stay completely impartial and objective, auditors really need to use a systematic 4-step methodology so that every single conclusion is backed by real data. Step 1, document review, checking your policies against the ISO requirements. Step 2, personnel interviews, getting out there and talking to the staff to gauge their true competence. Step 3, operational observation, actually walking the floor, watching how waste is segregated or chemicals are stored. And Step 4, record verification, analyzing the hard data, things like calibration certificates or emission logs. Honestly, if an auditor skips the observation part and just reads documents in a conference room, they aren't getting the true picture. That brings us to Section 3, classifying findings, or delivering the verdict. Before we even try to categorize anything, we have to define exactly what a nonconformance actually is. We need to make sure we aren't downplaying real risks as just opportunities for improvement. You see this a lot. Organizations try to soften the blow. They avoid the word nonconformance because they want to minimize perceived deficiencies. But Clause 9.2, it demands absolute accuracy. If there's a failure to meet a standard, a policy, or a legal obligation, and you have the objective evidence to prove it, you have to call it exactly what it is. Think of these classifications a bit like medical triage. It helps management instantly grasp the severity and the impact of an environmental risk. A major nonconformance is a significant failure, like, say, storing hazardous waste without any secondary containment. That's a direct regulatory violation. A minor nonconformance is more of an isolated deviation, maybe a single missing label on a waste bin, where the overall risk is pretty low. Then you have an observation, which points out a potential weakness. It hasn't broken a rule yet, but it's getting close. And finally, an opportunity for improvement is just that, a way to boost your environmental performance beyond the basic requirements. Getting this classification consistent is absolutely vital for tracking your trends over time.
Now for Section 4, Root Cause Analysis. This is where we truly solve the case.
You know why superficial corrective actions usually fail? Because they just treat the symptoms instead of curing the underlying organizational disease. Let's say you find missing calibration records. Treating the symptom is just firing off an email reminding the team to fill out the logs. Does that fix anything long term? No way. Curing the disease requires you to ask why. Why were they missing? Maybe the procedure is way too complex, or perhaps there's zero targeted training, or no digital tracking system in place at all. Lead auditors constantly flag organizations that apply these temporary band-aids without addressing the systemic process weaknesses underneath it all. This step-by-step life cycle is how you guarantee an environmental failure never repeats itself. First, you identify the issue. Second, you run a deep, thorough root cause analysis. Third, you implement a highly targeted corrective action. But here's the catch. The step where so many systems completely fall apart is step 4, verification. ISO 14001:2026 makes it clear that you can't just close out a corrective action in your software and call it a day. You have to conduct follow-up audits to prove, with actual data, that your fix successfully prevented the issue from coming back.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, continual improvement and protecting the organization.
Because here's the thing, a completed audit report isn't the end of the line. It's actually the strategic input your leadership team needs to continually improve the entire system. Clause 9.2 feeds directly into management review. If your internal audits are uncovering repeated issues with, energy consumption inefficiencies or inadequate pollution controls, top management needs to see that data. It absolutely shouldn't be buried in a drawer. These findings need to trigger strategic evaluations, budget allocations for better infrastructure, or maybe sweeping changes to training programs. That right there is how an audit transforms from a basic compliance chore into a real driver of operational excellence.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to think about. Take a really hard look at your own environmental management system and ask yourself, are your internal audits actually driving real, lasting change? Are your auditors acting as true investigators, armed with objective evidence and laser-focused on root causes? Or are they just sort of ticking boxes on a static, unchanging schedule? Because under ISO 14001:2026, the only way to achieve true environmental resilience is to stop treating the symptoms and start curing the disease.